Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. To the CSIR, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here, to be able to present and represent the DBSA, and also speak to you a little bit about one of our core sectors, which is the transport sector, and to speak a little bit around what we see as one of the key challenges in the sector around promoting industrialization around the Southern African continent or subcontinent, and also a little bit around the role that we see ourselves as a development finance institution playing in this regard. I'm hoping to learn quite as much as what I'm able to communicate as well. I know we've had a number of interactions now with the CSIR, specifically on the energy side, where there's been some very thought-provoking research that your energy team has done and has shared with us, which is helping to guide our investment strategy in the energy sector within South Africa and Southern Africa. And hopefully, this will also be the beginning of a relationship on the transport side as well. In terms of the topic and how I wanted to use up the 25 minutes around my presentation, just quickly wanted to give a bit of an overview of the DBSA for those of you who don't have a deep understanding of who we are and sort of what's our role in the broader game. Talk a bit in a bit more detail around the Southern African infrastructure landscape, and specifically from the perspective of one area which we think is quite critical to promoting industrialization, and that's the North-South corridor, which is a transport corridor starting from the Port of Durban, going through a number of countries to the Great Lakes region, southern DRC, and then into Tanzania as well. And then also speak a little bit about the initiatives that we're doing there, and also touch on one or two other initiatives in the transport sector that the DBSA has been taking part in. A little bit about ourselves. Our mission is to utilize infrastructure to promote economic growth, to improve quality of life, and also to advance regional integration. And I think certainly at least two of the elements that we're talking about today around promoting regional integration and promoting economic growth are covered in the topic around utilizing transport infrastructure to drive industrialization. Just some key points. We're 100% owned by the South African government, reporting into National Treasury. Our mandate, in terms of from a regional perspective, covers now the entire African continent, even though primarily our focus is Southern Africa, as our name, Development Bank of Southern Africa, refers. I'd say we're financially sound, about 85 billion rands of assets, about 32 billion of which is equity, and roughly 3 billion rands in sustainable profits for the last couple of years. We're externally rated, and our rating in terms of foreign currency is similar to that of the sovereign. Within local currency, we're AAA rated. And also we're globally accredited. So for instance, we've got accreditation with global entities such as the Global Environmental Facility, which is housed in the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, which is housed in South Korea but based out of the United Nations, and also the EU 6-pillar accreditation as well. This is a geographic view of our focus. About 70% of our assets are in South Africa, the remainder outside, with the primary focus in the countries of the SADC region. And in terms of how we see ourselves and our role within the infrastructure value chain, because I think this is quite important around how do you unlock infrastructure to promote industrialization. Historically, we've focused, as our name implies, as a bank on the financing side, but we see significant role to invest and partner with other entities on the planning side to make sure, as bankers, a banker will do any deal that they think they can get repaid on, and even some deals that they may not get repaid on if they're not around, right? And from our side, as a development finance institution, though, it's crucial to ensure that the deals that we do are tied into a macro sector plan. It could be, for instance, something like the IRP, which ties around the energy side, and similar regional plans around transport. And then we've also set aside a fund to invest in the correct levels of project preparation to ensure that only the right projects get financed. this means often paying for the technical studies to take an idea through that engineering life cycle, through the pre-feasibility studies and the feasibility studies as well, which often can cost in the region of up to 5% of the capital cost of a project. And often it's very difficult to find that funding available. And so as a development finance institution, we believe our role there in step 2 in the preparation is quite important as well. I won't go through significantly around our strategy, except just to say that our focus is not just to utilize our own balance sheet to do funding, but also to work with other entities, especially in the private sector, but also other public sector entities, to catalyze infrastructure. Now, we know that, if we think about transport now, lack of industry, materials, and labor, all of which hinder infrastructure development, and those are also issues in the transport side. And what I'm going to speak to specifically is some of these issues as they impact around Southern Africa. First, just give some data around where the investments are going in transport, and then deep dive a bit more into one area we think is of critical importance to industrialization of the subcontinent, which again is the North-South transport corridor. So again, a lot of the work that we do is tied into global compacts, such as the signing of the Sustainable Development Goals, the COP21 agreements around climate financing, but also regional ones around Agenda 2063 for the African Union, and also the regional infrastructure master plans of SADC. And then certainly also national plans, such as the National Development Plan. There's a number of strategic infrastructure projects of the 18 that tie into logistics infrastructure, and many of them also guide the work of the DBSA, including, for instance, unlocking the Northern Mineral Belt, an industrial corridor from Durban through Free State to Gauteng, and so on and so forth, including CIP 17 around regional integration. And that element around regional integration is also part of our mandate as the DBSA. Now, obviously in the transport side, there's that element that speaks to freight and logistics, and there's that element that speaks more to passenger transport, and really I'll concentrate more on the freight and logistics side in the discussion today around industrialization. Here's a view of the historical and projected public infrastructure spend in our country. Currently, it's in the range of about 300 billion rands per annum. This is from the medium-term expenditure frameworks. And if you look at the top bar there in those bar charts, roughly 100 billion per annum, that speaks to transport and logistics. So roughly 1 rand in 3 is going towards this element. Others obviously being energy, being the second element, and so on and so forth. And if we were to take the 3-year medium-term expenditure framework just for transport, sitting at about 328 billion rands, and break that down, you'll again notice that Transnet is again a critical player in this space, and I'll speak a little bit around some of the projects we're working on with Transnet, but also there are others around SANRAL, the provincial roads expenditure, PRASA, and other entities as well. And again, this is the public sector spend. And I think one of the critical issues, I'm not sure how much I'll be able to go through in the presentation, but maybe we can also discuss, is around what's the role for the private sector to come in and to add to the expenditure that the public sector is making in this space. Now, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about one area in particular that we as the DBSA is spending a lot of our time. And we think that it's quite crucial to both infrastructure development, but also ultimately to the development of the logistics chain and the industrial base in South Africa, and that is the North-South corridor. And the reason for this is we believe it's quite crucial to be able to grow into and add to the size of the market for South African industry. Now, Here's a couple of numbers that speaks to the impact of transport linkages or lack thereof for African countries. So for instance, if you were to look at it from the perspective of the cost for port and air transport costs, you'll notice that the costs for African countries that are landlocked is more than 2x that of Europe. So just the fact that you're landlocked doesn't mean it has to necessarily be that much more expensive. Similarly, arguably an even more important issue is long transit times. Because if you have very long transit times, what it means is you're no longer as relevant to the global logistics value chains, right? Because we're hearing how industry is even moving faster, turnaround times are quicker, and if your logistics times are greater, then it's that much more difficult for you to be integrated into these global logistics chains. And the North-South corridor speaks to quite a bit of these. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the slides because there is quite a bit, except to say that the demand for transport is growing in both South Africa and in Southern Africa. Obviously, as the numbers indicate, South Africa is still the leading player here compared to many of the other countries here in Southern Africa. And if we look at this, we're looking at projects to the tune of about $11 billion in this chain, of which roads and ports are the leading areas, but also in rail and then some other areas as well. And what's interesting, and I think it's also good here, is that a lot of the investments are going towards rehabilitation of existing infrastructure and improving it, as opposed to building new infrastructure. And this is something that's quite important because if we take the example of the situation we have in Southern Africa, where we've got existing rail linkages that we are investing in, and I'll give some examples of where we're investing and working on trying to improve them. In East Africa, the model that they've chosen is to replace the existing narrow gauge rail networks, for instance, with new standard gauge rail networks. Now, that allows for them to arguably standardize as a region and also potentially to go with where globally the system is moving to. But there are significant costs involved. As an example, if I can talk about Tanzania, which is an area where we've funded some of the pre-feasibility studies, the cost of upgrading the existing narrow gauge lines we estimated in the region of about $1.5 to $2 billion. That would allow them to take their existing rail lines that run something like 300,000 tons per annum and take it up to 20 million tons. They've taken a decision to go to standard gauge, which would allow them to do 50, 60 million tons per annum, but at a cost of $10 billion, or in that range. Now, you're talking about a country which its GDP, I believe, is in the region of about $45 to $50 billion. So what that means is you could be looking at 15 to 20% of the GDP of a country being taken up by that one project. Now, then the question is, how do you pay for it? Because, if you're going to fund the infrastructure, it has to be sustainable environmentally and socially, but crucially economically. If the people can't afford infrastructure, it won't be useful. It's a challenge we're now facing as a country in the energy side, and it's something that we need to be thinking on the transport side as well. Another area that I do want to give as a specific example that I think we as a country need to get right in order to be successful is around the one-stop border post and improving the efficiency of our border posts. And one example of that is the Bait Bridge border post between ourselves and Zimbabwe. It's a border post that impacts not just these two countries, but the entire region, because a significant amount of the road transport flows through that border post. And we need to work at improving the transport times. Now, there are other examples. For instance, the Chirundu one-stop border post saw a reduction of over 50% in their wait times through the establishment of a one-stop border post. And it's something that we need to be looking at to drive improvements as well. And here's some more of the details. This is some work that was done by the Boston Consulting Group along with the DBSA. And it just speaks to some of the improvements that have come through there. And again, these are all the different sectors that could benefit: mining, agriculture, retail, manufacturing, construction. So it's a number of industrial sectors that benefit from these improvements. And these are examples of some of the different countries that would benefit from improvements in the North-South corridor. Now, if that's the case, and just another view, this is again an estimate from the Boston Consulting Group, their belief is you could be looking at an existing 500,000 jobs, that could benefit through improvements through to the North-South corridor. Now, the question is, if this is the case, what are we doing about it, and what are some of the activities that need to be done to improve the logistics chain? And one of the areas, as I said, is we're focusing on the North-South corridor. It's a corridor along with the Bay Area Development Corridor that are two that we've highlighted as areas of focus. Some of the good news is the Southern African Development Community, as the regional economic community involved in these two, is focusing on setting up a specific program structure, and they've signed a memorandum of understanding in July to try to bring together and to drive the improvement in these two corridors. And one of the specific areas here that we're looking at is the North-South Rail Corridor. Now, the problem statement is less than 10% of that freight in that corridor, and the North-South Corridor is the largest corridor in the continent as well, flows through rail. And part of the reasons for that is there's a number of different rail operators across a number of different countries that are involved in this rail corridor. And what we're finding is that we need to look to see how do we improve the functioning of this corridor. So along those lines, the DBSA has provided $1 million as a starting point to fund some of the technical studies in the corridor. And what we're hoping is, and you remember I mentioned that you've got to do those technical studies to be able to unlock the exact project finance opportunities. And what we're hoping is that coming out of this will be somewhere in the range of about $700 million of capital expenditure that can go in to improve the functioning of this corridor, which we believe will then start to unlock some of the regional trade and investment opportunities. And this is something that we're working with the NAPAD Business Foundation and all of the different rail operators as well, because those improvements, in many of those cases, will have to be done by those rail operators. And again, this is just a view, improvement in regional integration and collaboration, reduced transport costs, and also some of the externalities that we think around the social and environmental side that'll be benefited as we're able to move from road to rail in this corridor. One other area that I haven't specifically talked about, because it hasn't been core to the mandate of the DBSA historically, is been how do you use the funding towards infrastructure to drive industrialization, meaning to drive job creation and to capture as much of the industrial value chain as possible. To give you an idea, I think the estimates are that about 6 to 8% of the GDP of South Africa goes towards infrastructure. If we don't utilize that 6 to 8% to capture as much of that value chain within our own country, then it'll be funds that are flowing overseas, impacting our balance of trade, and also not promoting job creation in the country. There's been a lot of successes, if you think about it, with the renewable energy program in South Africa, but one of the criticisms that's been raised is the fact that of the roughly 200 billion rands that's either been invested or in the pipeline in that program, not a lot of that has led to industrialization in our own country. So one specific area in the transport side that we're working on, and this is something that Transnet Rail Engineering came out with and was covered in Engineering News in August this year, was a program that we're working with them around promoting the building of wagons in South Africa for export into the rest of the continent. And we're working on providing some sort of a structured financing solution that can help them towards improving their exports and to be a little bit more competitive with the global providers, whether it be the Americans, the Chinese, or other entities who are taking advantage of the growth in this sector in the continent. I'm not going to go through some of the other ones in detail, but we have been investing in the BRT system as well. I think one of the issues that's been raised here is, are we getting value for money from the BRT system? But certainly we need to promote better and more investments in urban infrastructure and urban mass transit if we're also going to allow for better utilization of our people and improve the quality of life of our people as well. And again, just to say that from our perspective, our focus is around putting in place sustainable infrastructure in transport, whether that's economically sustainable, socially, and environmentally. And that infrastructure, we believe, then ultimately will lead to the promotion of industrialization across a number of different sectors in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohan.